Good evening. My name is Alexandra Szczepan. I'm a member of the Research Center for Memory Culture, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to the lecture from our lecture series, Potential Histories of East Central Europe. We are part of a research platform that tries to look for new approaches towards culture and history of East Central Europe within this framework of potential histories. And today our guest is Dr. Ureña Valerio, who is Associate Director for Program Development at American and Iberian Institute and Associate Research Professor in the Department of History at the University. Very good. Okay. Dr. Ureña Valerio received her BA in History from the University of Puerto Rico and MA and PhD in Central East European History from the University of Michigan. Her primary research interests include imperial and colonial studies, European migration to Latin America, Polish and German diasporas in Brazil, and the history of medicine and public health. Her dissertation was awarded the Distinguished Dissertation Award in Polish Studies by the Polish Institute of Arts and Sciences of America in 2010. And her book, based on the dissertation, Colonial Fantasies, Imperial by Science and the Making of Polishness on the Fringes of the German Empire, 1814-1820, published in 2019 by Ohio State University. University Press was the winner of the 2020 Kuczynski Book Prize in Polish Studies awarded by the Association for Slavic History and Eurasian Studies, and received honorable mention for the 2020 Health Prize for the Best Book by a Woman, awarded by the Association for Women in Slavic Studies. With Katalin Rak, Dr. Ureña Valerio co-edited a volume entitled Jewish Experiences Across the Americas, Local Histories Through Global Lenses, which received the 2023 Best Edited Volume Award from the Latin American Jewish Studies Association. She serves as a past president of the Consortium of Latin American Studies Programs and as a mentor in the Initiative for Diversity and Inclusion with the Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you here. And Dr. Ureña Valerio will talk about reimagining Polish colonialism and migration from a potential history perspective.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the warm introduction, and thank you and all the organizers for the invitation to share my work and research with all of you. I'm going to be reading my remarks. And I just wanted to say that it's really an honor and pleasure to be here in Krakow. It's been 20 years or so that last time I was here. And also I want to note that I made a slight change in the title of my presentation. So instead of reimagining Polish colonialism, I changed it to colonial entanglements because I think that reflects better the complexities that I want to and nuanced perspective that I want to talk about today. My presentation builds on two ongoing projects developed from my book, Colonial Fantasies, Imperial Realities, and will likely result in two distinct chapters. Through these projects, I seek to investigate the questions of colonial violence and race relations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, particularly as they intersect with knowledge production and the experiences of Polish migrants and indigenous communities. So drawing on Ariella Azoulay's concept of potential history, which I was recently introduced to thanks to this project, so very appreciative. So using that concept of potential history, I aim to foreground these marginalized narratives within Polish history, which remain largely absent from the historiography due to archival limitations, and in my view, the lasting impact
ale ja bym badania w Japonii też bardzo chętnie widziała.
Nie, ja też, ale już tak mówię, dobra, ustawiam planować, ale argument może być.
Sorry for interrupting, but
Can you do us? Can you do us? Then we can. Sorry for technical issues. We will have the presentation.
yes, now it's working. Thank you.
Okay.
So the people miss what I said before.
Because the problem was that actually everybody was unmuted, so we heard strange sounds.
Okay, yes. All right. So another aim of my presentation today is to reflect on how these case studies contribute to contemporary debates on restitution, and I hope I can make a case for the global refugee crisis. And although as a historian, I'm not yet prepared to fully adopt a radical approach, Azoulay advocates for his historical practice, I recognize her work as a compelling methodology for unlearning imperialism. And my hesitation is due to there's a lot of undoing in myself, undoing and unlearning. Her approach challenges us to confront and dismantle the colonial attitudes and assumptions that continue to shape current perspectives on migration and displacement. I hope these case studies will help to highlight this critical point. And I look forward to our conversation and appreciate any feedback you could provide me. As I say, these are two projects that I'm trying to conceptualize. And so any feedback will help me tremendously. So in her book, Potential History of Learning Imperialism, Ariella Azoulay calls on us to confront the imperial foundations underlying knowledge production and to reject the institutional structures that uphold imperial violence. She identified these structures, particularly archives, museums, historical narratives, sovereignty, and human rights, as sites where imperial violence is enacted and sustained. So there's not like a real break with the paradigm of empire. Azoulay invites us to unlearn this imperial grammar through potential history, which she defines as a rejection of imperialism conceptual framework, and instead, she defines us as a form of being with other, both living and dead, across time, against the separation of the past from the present, colonized people from the worlds and possessions, and history from politics. At the heart of potential history, the way I see it, is the conviction that historical inquiry should strive to recover repressed accounts and diverse worlds that persist into the present despite having been declared obsolete. Her approach advocates for a more ethical and inclusive historiography by critically rethinking how archives, artifacts, and documentation are interpreted. Ultimately, challenging colonial legacies and creating space to reclaim alternative possibilities that reshape our understanding of the past. In her book, she introduces the concept of the citizen historian to highlight the privileged stance historians often hold, making them incapable of recognizing institutionalized violence. By assuming the position of citizen historian and aligning with state interests, historians distance themselves from the people and community whose experiences are marginalized or erased in state archives or traditional archives, thereby helping perpetuate imperial violence. Instead, Azoulay argued that historians should act as companions, co-citizens, and active participants in reparative processes. The citizen historian identity also reinforces a separation between historians seen as knowledgeable experts and others as mere objects of study. This dichotomy perpetuates imperial violence by reinforcing a top-down approach to history, where communities impacted by imperialism are stripped of agency in how their stories are told and remembered. The author also emphasizes that potential history is an ongoing practice rather than a conclusion. So it's always where the premise of potential history is that we're always doing it. And encouraging historians and others to question the structural biases within archival records and historical narratives. This approach seeks to make history a space of potential and ethical engagement where present-day observers can actively work to unlearn the habits of imperialism, allowing suppressed perspective and alternate futures to emerge. I find Azoulay's treatment of the discipline of history and its practitioners as a single monolithic entity a bit problematic. Of course, the historian will say that. Some of her critiques overlook that history as a discipline actively reshapes the present by recovering agency or certain variants of history, right? By recovering agency, exploring alternative possibilities, and acknowledging untaken past. In a way, potential has always been central to historical inquiry. The potential for the past to have unfolded differently through challenging top-down narratives, and by shifting focus to a diverse array of subjects like women and the enslaved workers and the subaltern, etc. Moreover, historians have raised important critiques to traditional archives, highlighting the violence, biases, and omissions inherent in these repositories. In response, efforts have long been made to expand archival collections by incorporating alternative archives, oral history, community-centered records, and other strategies. What distinguishes Azoulay's work from other critiques made to the historical practice is her emphasis on restitution. Her challenge to traditional notions of a progressive temporality and her reimagining of the historian's role as an activist dedicated to repairing the enduring legacies of imperial violence. So now I'm going to talk about my first project, titled Colonial Violence, Knowledge Production and Reparation. The question of reparation, central to Azoulay's work, directs us to consider how historical narratives have been shaped by imperial violence and how we might begin to address and unravel these legacies. Azoulay argues that, and I think that's my first quote, that history as an imperial discipline tells plausible stories without questioning the violence that provides its practitioners with the building blocks that render the stories plausible. Word, shredded violence into legible pieces to compose historical narrative. This assertion raises a profound challenge. How can we revisit these constructed narratives, acknowledging and undoing the destructive forces of colonialism that render them plausible and legible? How can we denormalize the violence produced and upheld by imperial system to allow us to repair? To engage in this work of reparation is not simply to recognize this violent foundation, but to actively participate in dismantling the power structures that allow them to persist. This means questioning the way in which knowledge itself has been produced, circulated, and legitimized. And it involves asking how we, as historians, can reposition ourselves in relation to those whose stories have been fragmented, distorted, or erased within official narratives. What might it mean to act as co-citizens alongside the descendants of those affected? Not as passive observers, but as active participants in the restoration of their history, identities, and agency. How can our practices begin to restore what was once destroyed? And how can historical work serve as means of reparation and justice rather than perpetuating erasure? In 2017, the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation in Berlin launched a 2-year project to investigate the origins of over 1,000 human skulls collected in the early 20th century from territories that were part of the former German East Africa colony, particularly from modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and parts of Kenya. This initiative, led by researchers from the Museum of Prehistory and Early History, forms part of Germany's broader efforts to confront its colonial legacy and repatriate significant numbers of human remains acquired through violent and illegal means. The whole collection entails more than 1,000 skulls, bones, and other body parts and artifacts taken from former colonies. A substantial portion of the skulls under examination belong to Felix von Luschen, an Austrian physician and physical anthropologist who became the director of the Africa and Oceania Department at the Royal Ethnological Museum Berlin in 1905. Central to this inquiry are the works of Polish anthropologist Jan Czekanowski, who amassed most of the skulls in the Luschen collection between 1907 and 1909, while accompanied to Adolf Friedrich from Mecklenburg on a scientific mission to East Central Africa. Czekanowski's prominent role in Germany's reckoning with its colonial past and the fraught practice of collecting cultural artifacts in East Central Africa underscore the fact that colonialism in the late 19th and early 20th centuries was a widespread European enterprise supported by transnational and trans-imperial professional networks. This case reveals the complex layers of accountability and restitution that characterize historical reparation. It also serves as a reminder that during the partition period, Poles were not indifferent or completely excluded from colonial activities. I have previously argued in my book. Using the original copy of the diary that Czekanowski kept during his expedition, which he was required to submit to German authorities upon his return, this project aims to investigate how scientific knowledge was produced within and benefited from unequal power dynamics, structural violence, and racism. It will be illuminating to compare this diary with other versions and scientific works that Czekanowski later published, examining how scientific knowledge often silences or neutralizes uncomfortable truths about the violent context of its creation. Given that the diary's primary audience was the German colonial administration, I am particularly interested in exploring how Czekanowski accounts may have been shaped to align with their colonial objectives. In other words, does the diary reveal the liminal positions that Poles often occupy in relation to the colonial world, a perspective frequently reflected in his other texts? According to scholar Joanna Barr, there are two known copies of Czekanowski diaries. One held at Warsaw University, which formerly belonged to Czekanowski's daughter, and another at the Ethnological Museum in Berlin. I'm currently working with a digital copy of the Berlin version, generously provided by a colleague who worked on the Czekanowski collection as part of the restitution process that I mentioned earlier. Just last week, I learned that the Warsaw copy was transcribed and published last year. Although I have not yet accessed the published version, I am eager to compare the two. It's not clear to me if the copies are exactly the same. And so I have many questions about these different versions. Since the Berlin copy has never been transcribed, the published Warsaw version, if they're entirely the same, will be invaluable in helping me advance and move faster with this research. Czekanowski wrote the diary primarily in German, with sections in French, Polish, and various local languages. As the head of the ethnological anthropological field of the 1907 German expedition to East Africa, Jan Czekanowski became a prolific collector of human remains in the colonies. In Barbara Tessman's and Marius Kobalek's work about the skulls gathered from the island of the dead in Muspila, Tanzania, they included the following exchange between Felix von Lucian and Czekanowski that highlights some of the practices used by Czekanowski when collecting these remains. And I'm quoting here. So Lucian's write to Czekanowski saying, I am very curious about the Busira's skull. Please write to me and tell me how you actually managed to get the matter done so quickly. If Europeans help you, a letter of thanks is probably necessary or useful. And to that, Czekanowski wrote back very briefly, I visited the Isle of the Dead and stole the skulls. The authors of the article where this exchange is included in suggest that to steal likely involves the deliberate appropriation of items against the will of descendants without necessarily requiring overt violence or explicit threats. However, we can push back on this interpretation as the anthropologists had access to and typically was accompanied by Ascari soldiers during artifact collection, which suggests that the threat of violence, the implicit threat of violence was always present. The absence of in-ground burial practices in some colonies, such as in Rwanda, also facilitated the work of the anthropologists. Bodies were often left unburied or placed in caves, providing easier access for the collection. Reportedly, Czekanowski also gathered human remains from execution sites in Nyanza near the royal palace, a view that has been contested by local memory. The pervasive violence in the colony undoubtedly contributed to the scientific practice, as shown by this interesting quote from Father Robert Iryumukabe in the Rwasa parish. It's a long one, so bear with me. The Journal of Ruasa Mission tells how Czekanowski was a strange person. The journal says that he collected human remains everywhere and he talked to everybody. At this time, bodies were not buried underground. They were exposed in forests instead. In addition, there were many conflicts around. This part of the North had not recognized the legitimacy of the new king. The Ruasa mission was created in 1903, and at the beginning, local people who did not want to see the white fathers here regularly attacked the priest. The priest had to do some patrolling during the night with their guns. At other times, they asked priests from Nyondo mission to come and support them as the number of attacks was increasing. After the attacks, German soldiers conducted punitive expedition. At the end of all of those conflicts, there were human remains everywhere in the vicinity of the mission. This made it easy for him to walk around and find human remains on the surface. Under violent colonial conditions, the act of collecting submitted colonial subjects to their ultimate objectification and symbolic death, as their remains, devoid of agency and separated from their local context, were incorporated into scientific and anthropological knowledge systems. Practice of sending human remains to museums in Germany and other parts of Europe rested on the ultimate death committed by scientists. Paradoxically, Czekanowski works now, which once contributed to the symbolic erasure, now serve as a resource for historians engaged in efforts to repair and restitution. So now I'm going to address the second project that I'm trying to develop, which has to do with Polish migration and the indigenous communities in southern Brazil. So expanding on the topic of colonial violence, addressing the previous section, the experience of Polish migrants in Brazil provides a compelling perspective on how racial dynamics in colonial contexts shaped interactions between settlers and indigenous populations. While race and ethnicity were central to colonial agendas in Africa, they also play a crucial role in shaping the relationship that developed between Polish colonists and indigenous communities. In my previous research, I focused primarily on the establishment of Polish colonies from the perspective of Polish nationalist aspirations. This European-centered approach, along with limited access to Brazilian sources, restricted my ability to examine Polish interactions with local populations in depth. My current interest, however, is to investigate this topic not only through the lens of conflict, but also by exploring the complex, nuanced exchanges and relationships that go beyond confrontation. However, since the sources I have consulted thus far primarily emphasize conflicts between indigenous community and Polish settlers, the examples that I'm going to be presenting today mainly on instances of, or just focus on instances of confrontation. Polish historiography on the interactions between Polish migrants in Brazil and indigenous community is relatively underdeveloped, often overshadowed by narratives centered on Polish national identity, migration experiences, and settlement achievements. Few studies explicitly address the relationship between Polish settlers and indigenous communities in Brazil. When these interactions are mentioned, they're often framed within the broader context of settler colonialism or the Polish settlers' adaptation to a new environment, rather than focusing on the indigenous perspective or the implications of this encounter. And here this is a tremendous challenge, right? Additionally, due to the fragmentation of sources, and a general scarcity of research on this topic in Polish history, these intercultural interactions remain marginal in the historiography of Polish migration. Polish immigrants in Brazil and other regions of Latin America were beneficiaries of racially discriminatory colonization policies that prioritize white Europeans over non-European populations. These policies were part of a larger national agenda aimed at whitening the population and advancing a vision of modernization aligned with European ideals. To facilitate this objective, recruitment agents were deployed throughout Europe to attract white settlers, positioning them as preferable contributors to the desired demographic, cultural, and economic transformation of the nation state. In 1969, Rui Wachowicz, an important historian from Paraná who studies the Polish diaspora, published an insightful article examining the conflicts between European colonizers and the Botocudo, the proper name now is Choclen indigenous population. He, of course, placed particular focus on Polish historical sources. The Botocudos, primarily hunter-gatherers who historically resided in the regions of Paraná and Santa Catarina, experienced near extermination due to intense colonization efforts. Those who survived the colonization pressures were eventually moved to a reserve in Santa Catarina in 1926. Today, they continue to face challenges related to land rights and the depletion of natural resources. They also struggle with state authorities regarding the demarcation of their lands. In his work, Wachowicz notes that conflicts between European settlers and indigenous community in general intensified from the latter part of the 19th century to the early 20th century. This period of heightened tension coincided with a significant wave of European migration and particularly among Polish settlers. This is the time where there was the Brazilian fever, which reached its peak along the left banks of the Negro and Iguazu rivers and within the Itajaí Valley. This influx intensified competition over territory and resources, placing significant pressure on the Botocudo people and contributing to their displacement. The incursion into Botocudo lands by colonies and the state, particularly marked by the construction of the São Paulo-Rio Grande do Sul Railroad, which crossed right through indigenous territory, provoked a series of conflicts that significantly contributed to the decimation of the Botocudo population. A critical turning point in relations occurred in 1889 with the establishment of the Itaiopolis colony, a predominantly Polish settlement established at the heart of Botocudo lands. The land plots allocated to the colonies were established in a cemetery within sacred indigenous territories. This ignited a profound indignation among indigenous community, leading to an escalation in their resistance efforts. Wachowicz notes that following this event, Botocudo attacks increased considerably, both in scale and frequency. During this period, the practice of employing brugueiros as a means to protect white settlers became widespread. Brugueiros, typically caboclos are people of mixed descent, of indigenous and European descent, were hired to attack and hunt indigenous people, often as part of efforts to clear lands for settlement and reduce resistance from native communities. It is worth mentioning that at the turn of the 20th century, local government authorities influenced by nativist ideologies opposed the use of brugueros, leading to conflicts with colonists. Conflicts between the Botocudos and colonies also drew foreign intervention, exemplified by the actions of Austro-Hungarian Vice-Consul in Curitiba, Walter Paul, who dispatched a representative to assess the condition and colonies concerned, particularly the Ukrainian colonies in Paraná. In her study, Migrants on the Periphery, Ursula Proust explains how these diplomatic actions heightened tensions between local and federal authorities in Brazil at the turn of the century. While local officials resisted diplomats' demands to arm the colonies, focusing instead of protecting indigenous populations, federal authorities prioritized the security and interests of the migrants, reflecting divergent approaches to violence in the colonies. And how these two fit together. So I think Azoulay theory helped me to draw a thread between the two. So drawing on Azoulay's concept of potential history, my objective today has been to foreground instances of colonial violence that are frequently marginalized in conventional historical narratives. I outlined my intended project involving Jan Czekanowski's diary, which aims to confront the symbolic erasure of colonial subject in the production of knowledge, a process enabled and perpetuated by racist structures of power. Additionally, in my second project, I examined the subject of migration, aiming to illustrate how the migration movement of Poles and other Europeans to Brazil was part of a colonization process that was highly racist and prioritized European settlers, often to the detriment, displacement, and near extinction of indigenous populations. Poland's historical experience of migration and settlement, both as a site of emigration and as a participant in colonial projects abroad, provides a unique lens through which to understand contemporary challenges. Recognizing the colonial dynamics within Polish settler history in Latin America and the resulting cross-cultural entanglements encourages a deeper understanding of how historical relationships of power and displacement resonate or might resonate today. It also helps us to imagine potential scenarios where Poles, by reflecting on their own history of migration and displacement in the 19th century, become co-citizens of those experiences displacement today, or the potential history in Brazil of Polish descendants becoming co-citizens with the plight that the Botocudo community are still facing today. Thank you.
Very much. Inspiring talk. And for the moment, the floor for questions, comments, questions, both for the audience here and online. And for our audience online, please raise your hand to pose a question or ask in the chat, whichever way is more comfortable for you. Yes, please ask and comment. Maybe warm up the room. I will ask some very general question because it's very interesting for me what you were when you were as well as concepts and you were talking about this citizen historian, and I wonder your position as the historian working in Albuquerque. Who would it be, this citizen historian? How do you imagine this role?
So I want to be a co-citizen rather than a citizen. the co-citizen. Okay, thank you for asking that question. And that's something that, especially moving to Albuquerque, has taken like a center stage in me, because Albuquerque, the state of New Mexico, it's a border state, right? So the issues of migrations are highly important. And the city of Albuquerque is like a refuge for migrants. There's a lot of activism supporting migrant rights. And so I've become involved in this organization that is interfaith organization, including Lutherans, Mormons, Catholics, also people from the University of New Mexico. There's a network of receiving those refugees that have been recently released from detention camps in El Paso, Texas, and then the group received them in Albuquerque with the support of the city of Albuquerque that offered the hotel stay and some of the meals. And so what I do with that group is that I wait for the refugees at the airport, and I accompany them through the check-ins, right? Because many of them, they've never traveled via plane, or if they've traveled, there's language barrier, right? And also the whole airport system is too overwhelming to them. So in reflecting about this co-citizen concept, I see myself as a co-citizen because literally I'm accompanying them. And these are people who, depending where they're coming from, but most of them, they have horrible stories to tell. Their journey are highly traumatic. And because I'm one of the few people in this organization that is a native speaker in Spanish, some people just open up to me. And one of the things is that you don't ask questions, you don't judge. Your role is just accompany them. But they open up, and then, I mean, they're like super traumatic stories. People who started as a family, and then only a few of them arrive because people die along the way. And so I just don't know how to translate that co-citizenship into my work as a historian. I'm lacking the tools to completely fulfill what Azoulay is asking us to do. Or maybe I'm doing part of it and I'm not even aware that I'm doing. Thank you for that question.
Thank you. Okay. It's really like interesting conjecture of like what you're doing as a historian, and at the same time like co-citizen of living in some specific geographical place. There is one. Yes, should we do something?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very insightful. I'm Carolina. I'm a PhD student from Colombia at the University of Warsaw, and it was great to see the trajectory of your studies. My question was more about like the challenges of framing and conceptualizing Polish colonialism, because I've been in Poland for 2 years, and every time that I try to understand more about, colonial powers in Europe back in the times, there's always this kind of comment that I received that Poland was a subject of permanent colonization, but not necessarily an actor, part of that narrative, right? So I'm asking, if I'm a sociologist, not a historian, have you faced any challenges regarding analyzing this case of study? And if you have any kind of insights on the repercussions of maybe this misunderstanding or not addressing that part of history in current discussions in Poland. Right now, we are seeing like increase of nationalist discourses tied with anti-migration discourses. So I don't know if you see that it could be some kind of insights for the present, because I'm more like focused on the present, but it was super interesting. So thank you for sharing. And yeah, that's it.
Thank you. I've received a lot of pushback and challenges when I started my project 20 years ago. I was always interested in studying colonialism, but I didn't want to study it in the usual places in former colonies. And I was interested in post-colonialism. I was reading all this post-colonial theory, and I wanted, and part of post-colonial theory is how the other shape the European, the colonizer. So based on that premise, I wanted to study how the colonies or how colonial relations influence identity formation in Europe. And so at the time when I was, I started to study this issue, there was already in German studies and I'm a 19th century historian, and I studied the Prussian partition, the German side of the partitions. And already in German studies, there were works conceptualizing Poland and generally Eastern Europe as a colonial site, but mainly to study and make connections with extermination that happened during Second World War. And so making that posting your study as to study Poland as a colony was fun, whether you while you were studying that period of time. So pushing it to the 19th century was more challenging. But the other thing that I wanted to do was also study Polish agency within colonialism and this idea that, you know, that was another problem that I had with this conceptualization from German study. It was positing Poles as a victim in colonial agendas, and I wanted to complicate that and show them as victims, but also as participants. And but I still, and back then I received more pushback than now, but still people question that it is a framework that cannot be applied everywhere in 19th century, in all the territories of the 19th century Poland, because the power dynamics in the different partitions were different. And most people understand that the Prussian part of the Prussian Polish territories lends itself to a more colonial framework than other parts. Last week I was at this conference that people are pushing this boundary and doing more post-colonial works, and it was interesting to see how the topic increased from where I started 20 years ago to now. There are more diverse topics that people are studying different periods of time. and different issues, and that was heartening for me to say. And actually, in my presentation there, I was saying, oh, post-colonial studies is becoming more mainstream in Polish history. But now, from what you're saying, maybe not. Or also the post-colonial is used in very problematic way of only being recognizing one aspect of the relations and emphasizing that victimhood. So it's very interesting, the post-colonial approach, how people are using it depending on your political ideology. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. This is really fascinating. So as a Polish person, I'm just kind of blown right now. That, you know, of course, Polish people think of themselves as being colonized and as migrants in the world, but never as having colonized. So this information is like almost brand new to me. But now doing a quick search and based on some of what you said, sure enough, there's a bit written about the correlation between immigrants or migrants and colonists in South America from Poland. And here, at least in this one article, I haven't found your writing yet. Maybe you can explain it. Kind of, it talks about different groups. That there was an elite that was kind of maintaining this new Poland and colonialism. It says in South America, maybe not in Brazil specifically, while the actual people that were settling there were peasants or they were farmers or something. And there was some kind of like dynamic that must have happened along the way that, as the way you're framing, these peasants and farmers that are there are actually part of the colonialist project because of the violence, I assume, that they're imposing. Like that's the criteria that I understand, even though, so there is the kind of like that blurry line between migrants and colonizers in some ways that you're exploring, if I understand. And the other thing I did a quick search on is this potential history of learning imperialism, fascinating. And interestingly, in the summary, it seems she dedicates quite a bit to writing about Palestine. I know your research is on South America, but I wonder if you can say a little bit about that or the way she presents it in her book. Thank you.
Okay. Well, regarding the Palestine issue, I'm not an expert in that area, but I think what is fascinating and what she's trying to show there is that there are identities in the region that were more inclusive, that because of the nationalistic agenda were erased, but people still carry those identities. So she's calling for recognizing those identities and basically and ultimately restitute the rights of Palestinians to that land, right, that have been largely displaced. But again, that's not my area of expertise. Regarding your question about the peasants and the organization of the colonies in Brazil, so the overwhelming majority of people who settled to Brazil at the time were peasants. Like this, most people were coming due to economic pressures from Europe, and there were nationalists who tried to keep the Polish identity in these colonies, and there were efforts to provide priests, teachers to preserve the language and Polish culture. How peasants become colonizer? I think the power dynamics in Brazil that are led not only by first the Brazilian Empire and then the Brazilian Republic, but also by other empires, right? But those power dynamics and the fact that the colonization process was highly racist, creating the condition for that peasant emigrating from Europe to consider themselves a pioneer, clearing forests, bringing quote unquote civilization into this woodlands in Brazil. So that's a way of conceptualizing their involvement in colonialism.
From online audience.
Hello, can you hear me? Hello. Well, thank you for your presentation, and I have to say that I love your book, Colonial Fantasies, Imperial Realities, and I think it's a shame it hasn't been translated into Polish yet. My question is, have you noticed any colonial entanglements or hierarchies between Polish settlers in Brazil with all these different origins? I mean, Ruthenians, Polish, Jewish, and so on. I mean, the settlers from the Polish lands, because these hierarchies were produced back in Polish lands, especially by the nationalist elites. And I was just wondering whether these differences, hierarchies, were somehow visible in Brazil. And I also have one commentary about Polish version or Polish application of post-colonial theory. It is full of misunderstandings and hostile takeovers. Well, that's my opinion about this version of post-colonial theory. Thank you.
So if there's like a hierarchy between the different groups coming from Europe, that's
exactly. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one thing, my work mostly focused on Polish colonies. My goal with this new project is to get into those colonies that were mixed, that there were different Europeans living together or different people coming from the different partitions. I mean, and like Ukrainians living with Poles in a colony, how did that look like? So that's something that I would like to study now. But from what I can see in the little that I'm being able to access into these local relations is that there's a lot of collaborations between Europeans. It's like the same dynamics that you see in Africa. You can see them also in Brazil, like a lot of cooperation to cooperate. Of course, there's also like competition in terms of economic resources, but vis-a-vis, like for example, the indigenous, these conflicts with indigenous community, you can say that Europeans came together to protect themselves. And so I don't know if that answered your question, but bottom line is I would like to explore more mixed colonies so that I can understand better those local relations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can you say? So we have a question from Susanna Chuba.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I will not turn the camera on because I have a cold and I'm not pretty representative. But I also wanted to join Claudia in saying that if your book was published in Polish and translated into Polish, maybe we indeed could have a slightly different discussion about what colonial implication means in Polish context. And And yes, I also agree with Claudia about the fact that in Poland, post-colonial theory is being appropriated in very problematic ways on many levels. But I'm based in Austria at the moment, and unlike Prussia, Austria has a different history of colonization, but how post-colonial scholars are addressing it at the moment in this country is through the frame of colonialism without colonies. So colonialism that is not necessarily state-bound, but produces colonial infrastructures of knowledge production, infrastructures of economic investment or appropriation or expropriation, actually. And I think that this is a very nice frame to actually think about Polish colonialism, this colonialism without colonism, but which works through science. The Czechanowski's involvement, for instance, in the collection of human remains, or settler colonialism, which of course they are peasants and they are positioned differently than, for instance, other colonialists. But what they share with other colonialists is the whiteness, and I think that it's your project in speaking about both infrastructures, colonial infrastructures, is absolutely amazing, and actually this is a project that I always dreamt of conducting myself. So. I was just curious. I was curious if this frame of colonialism without colonies somehow helps to fight the backlash of Polish citizen historians, because this is still the dominant perspective, of course.
Yeah, I think absolutely. Like that's what we need to point out. That the fact you don't not having colonies doesn't mean that the colonial thinking and or benefiting from colonial power was absent as well. So I really appreciate your comments, and this was precisely what I was trying to show in my work, that there are not only Poles, there are other cases, of course, that people becoming highly engaged and how in colonial projects and how those come back home. And so I don't have much more to say, but just to thank you for your comments.
We already have anti-Semitism called Jews, so colonialism called colonists are a great addition to our Polish identity struggles.
And that might be a criticism that people might say, right? Like, do we need another?
So just a follow-up question to this issue, a very short one, because I can see that we have, I think, another raised hand over there. So I was wondering now whether this colonialism without colonies is quite exceptional phenomenon, like that we have Polish colonialism without colonies, or maybe that there are like some other phenomena similar in structure that can be compared to this Polish case. We have something like, I don't know, maybe in also in Central Eastern Europe, some other nations who are also, let's say, invested so much into this colonial imagination that they have colonies. What would be your take?
Well, you know, the Polish cases always compare, well, from like with Ireland and Scots, and but I think in Eastern Europe, I think any other groups, Czechs and other people might have signed up the same or very similar engagements with colonialism. It's just I don't know much about those cases. In thinking, and maybe this is something that helped me conceptualize my project in the beginning. When I was in Puerto Rico, I was studying the concept of a nation state in the 1950s, and where Puerto Rico became a window for democracy, and people from Latin America and several parts of Africa were brought to the island to learn about democracy. And then I was seeing this discourse of the Puerto Ricans with a colonial attitude towards other. And I've never been a nation state, never had colonies, but still you see this investment people have in colonial relations and how it's reproduced.
Thank you. It's Marlena Szczygielska. Okay, Marlena, welcome.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me or?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you again. I'm another fan of your book. It's really helped me and I'm using it in my work. And my question is kind of about your position towards whether you identify yourself more as post-colonial or more decolonial historian. Of course, decolonization has gained a lot of traction recently, and I totally agree with people who spoke before me in saying that in Poland, the post-colonial theory has its kind of danger zones in being appropriated very often. But at the same time, I do think that there's much more works coming out about Polish colonialism and Polish longings for colonialism, and the landscape is changing quite a lot. I mean, critical works, not apologetic ones, of course. And I'm just really fresh after watching the documentary that won last year's Berlinale, Dahomey, which is tackling the concept, the idea of restitution, which I think you mentioned in the beginning quite briefly. And the way that the movie does it, it's a documentary. It's really, I recommend it. I cannot use the chat option, so I cannot send any links at the moment. But if you haven't seen that film, it's really great. But I think the most powerful thing that it does is that it doesn't talk so much about the colonizers, but it actually, shows the colonial subjects, the people who are now finally receiving back just a fraction of stolen artworks and artifacts in Benin. This is a very powerful thing to do. And I wonder, how do you do that in your future project? Because it seems like you're kind of doing something similar, that you're trying to also show the colonized people, not only the colonizers. And I understand it's extremely difficult, especially with the case of Poland, where like you have to also kind of construct the Polish colonist, since this is not such an obvious figure itself.
Yeah.
But at the same time, kind of giving some kind of agency and voice and visibility to the colonized people, it seems like an extremely important, if you think about your project as a decolonial one, especially not only post-colonial, and would be quite a powerful thing to do. Yeah, so that's a kind of common question. But thank you again for the lecture. It was really interesting.
Thank you for the question, and that's something I've never asked myself. For me, the post-colonial framework it's an umbrella that I also see the colonial within that umbrella. But I think you're absolutely right. What I want to do with this new projects, or well, especially the one for Brazil, is to focus more on the colonized side of things. So maybe I'm moving from post-colonial to decolonial, but I've never I didn't think about it until today. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions or comments?
I have a question. I'm not catching up with your book. Okay, amazing. I'm gonna read it. And you mentioned in the summary that there's an element of medicine that you discussed. How does that come into the story?
Yes. So the book, it's a highly ambitious one. that look at medicine as an entry into colonialism, in the sense that I focus in the Prussian Polish provinces and overseas colonies in Germany, in Africa, and colonies in Brazil, right? So the medicine aspect is and then the racial and racialization of people that they produce is what's holding everything together. And then the medicine, especially in the European side of things, helped me to talk about Poles as colonized, in the sense of receiving these civilizing agendas that were very much tied up with protecting this nation against diseases and things like that.
It's a great chapter. It's important part of it. I wanted to ask you also about the visual archives of the phenomena you plan to research on. This Brazilian case, can we base ourselves on any photographs or artifacts? What is on the visuality side that is left that you can use?
So, as I mentioned earlier today, when I went to the archive in Brazil, I only consulted the collection of they have a collection for colonists, collection for Brazilian, and collection for indigenous community. And at the time, and also I didn't have the time back then, I only had 1 week to gather sources. I only consulted the colonists collection, the migrants collection, and so there were pictures there and about from the colonies and everyday lives in the colonies, which are very interesting. But my immediate reaction to that is what is not pictured here. Where are the Afro-Brazilians? Where are other people here? And so I don't think
these are pictures of Polish colonists themselves, but without
exactly, but without non-Polish people. So I think it will be interesting to analyze that, and in terms of the when dealing with pictures and not knowing what I'm going to find there, if the pictures are highly violent, I think I would like to be working with the community to see if they want those pictures to be put up there. Because I think that images can also reproduce or perpetuate those that violence. So, and I being now in New Mexico, and I know scholars, they usually work with the indigenous community, and the research agenda is very much dictated by their needs. So, yeah, how to do that in Brazil, where, for example, the Potofuro that I talked about, there are only 2,000 people left. And the other major group, the Kaingan, there are 16,000 people left. And I think, at least for the Potofuro, the main concern is land rights at the moment. But no, I haven't established connections with the indigenous community, and relations take time to gain trust and so on. But I'm not an expert on the visual archive, so I'll be hesitant to venture myself into that.
Thank you. Share a comment or question about what you just said and what you told us about this issue of being a historian as well as an activist or co-citizen or doing co-citizenship. And I wonder if that's the answer to that, being this guardian of the ethical issues or advocate or even the link between the current community that exists. It's a low number, but still they are there. And you as a historian cares for this community not to be exposed to those violent pictures, for example. Maybe I'm wrong there, but
No,
I think listening to you, it like came to my mind that it might be like your positionality within your research might be also, and because you could say, yeah, sure, let's just use those pictures and expose this violence and like put it there without having in mind the needs of this group, right?
Yeah, but I mean, that's my constraint, that I'm not versed in. Maybe people who are trained, they can do an excellent job putting those pictures down, contextualizing, so it doesn't reproduce or perpetuate the violence. But yeah, you're right. Like ideally, I want to be that historians that write in consultation with others, to put it in general terms.
That's a great idea that we could are there questions or comments you'd like to voice? If not, I would like to very profoundly thank you for your lecture and this meeting, and it's really, really inspiring on many levels. Our guest was Lenny Ureña Valerio, and this was a part of Potential Histories of East Central Europe series. So I invite you to follow our next events, and thank you so much for the discussion, questions, comments.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Learning about it.